All right, let's dive in. Today we're tackling a topic that often feels like a black box: construction project costs. We've got construction project cost planning and control as our guide, and it's a hefty one. But we're going to break it down and pull out those key insights.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you think about costs, it's not just that initial price tag. We're talking about the whole life cycle here, from the initial budgeting to like the long-term operating costs and all that.
Right, right. It's kind of like when you think about buying a car, you don't just think about the sticker price, right? You think about gas, insurance, all those things over time. And speaking of guides, one thing that really jumps out from the book is the architect's role. They're not just designers, are they?
No, not at all. They're kind of financial advisors for the project too. Just like, you might go to an expert in your field for advice. Architects often bring in these specialized cost consultants to help out.
Okay, so it's a team effort, which makes sense, right? You need all those different perspectives. Um, the book talks about these different ways to actually estimate costs, and it struck me that they're not all created equal.
No, for sure. You have three main approaches: analogous, parametric, and bottom up. Analogous is kind of like if you're building a house, you think back to, oh, when my friend renovated their kitchen, how much did that cost? It's quick, but it might not be that accurate.
Yeah.
Then you have parametric. That's where you're using specific units. So let's say you're calculating flooring costs. You're looking at the square footage. That's going to be a little more detailed and probably more reliable.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. So what about this bottom-up method? That sounds pretty intense.
It is. It is. You can picture a contractor with their clipboard just meticulously listing out every single material, every hour of labor. It's the most accurate, for sure, but it definitely takes time.
So if you're like just starting out, maybe in the early stages, that quick analogous estimate, that might be enough to get you going. But if you want a really solid budget, you're going to need that bottom-up approach. This is super valuable, I think, for, anyone who's even thinking about doing a construction project. It's not just materials and labor, though, right? There's all sorts of other factors that can really impact those costs.
Oh, yeah, definitely. You've got the whole economic and political climate to consider, like inflation, right? Market conditions, even the political scene can play a role. Just like, remember a few years back, those supply chain issues? That hits so many industries, construction included.
Yeah, that was hard to miss. But what about the site itself? Does location play a role? Like building in a desert versus, building a cabin in the woods. I would imagine those are pretty different.
They are. Things like challenging terrain, extreme weather, a remote location, it all adds up. And of course, the building's design itself. I mean, a simple warehouse versus a multi-story art museum, those are two very different budgets right there.
Two very different beasts. Okay, so lots of external factors there. But the book also mentions that the client themselves can actually impact costs. How so?
Well, demanding timelines can lead to rushed decisions, which ultimately it all costs more. Then there's the complexity of the bidding process and even the dynamics between the stakeholders. If people aren't getting along or there are disagreements, that can cause delays. And delays always mean more money. So clear communication, realistic expectations, that's key to keeping things on track and within budget.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like any kind of team project, right? Good communication is key. I imagine also, changing the project scope midway through, that's got to be a budget killer.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. Just imagine you're halfway through building a house and suddenly, you know what? We need a pool. The book calls it scope creep, and it's a huge reason projects go over budget.
Yeah, makes sense. So we've covered different cost estimation methods and a whole bunch of factors that can impact the bottom line. But the book doesn't just focus on, like, those initial construction costs, does it?
You're catching on. It goes way beyond that. There's life cycle costs, and then there's this fascinating concept called value engineering.
All right, well, I'm all ears. Let's unpack those.
So life cycle costs, you're looking beyond just the initial build. You're factoring in operating expenses, maintenance expenses. It's about understanding the true cost of owning and maintaining that building over its entire life.
It's like factoring in, the fuel efficiency and maintenance when you buy a car. You're thinking long term.
Exactly. And then value engineering comes in, and this is about optimizing project value without having to sacrifice quality. So finding smart solutions, smart substitutions, not just cutting corners.
So working smarter, not harder. This is really eye-opening. There's so much more to construction costs than meets the eye.
There really is. And then the book, it touches on another really interesting concept: embodied energy.
Now, that's a new one for me. What's that all about?
So embodied energy refers to the total energy consumed throughout a material's entire life cycle, from its creation to when it's eventually disposed of. It's a way to understand those hidden environmental costs associated with, well, with the materials we use to build.
Wow. That's something I never even considered before. Really makes you think about all the choices we make when it comes to construction. We've covered a lot of ground already, but I feel like there's still so much more to explore.
Oh, there is. There's a lot more to unpack, so we'll be back soon to continue our deep dive into the world of construction project costs. Stay tuned.
Okay, so we're back and ready to keep digging into this world of construction costs. Before we took a break, we were talking about embodied energy. That hidden environmental impact of the materials we use. It really gets you thinking about those choices beyond just the initial price.
It does. It's something that, as we're moving towards more sustainable building practices, it's becoming a bigger and bigger concern. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about some of the specific resources and techniques for actually managing these costs. Our trusty guide here, Construction Project Cost Planning and Control, it really highlights the role of these cost consultants, particularly these quantity
Quantity
surveyors.
surveyors. Now,
Okay.
those are the folks who get into the nitty-gritty numbers, right?
Yeah, they're the experts at really dissecting costs, providing those really detailed breakdowns. They use historical data. They know about current market conditions. Are kind of like detectives, uncovering those hidden costs and potential risks.
So even if you have experienced architects, a solid plan, having one of these quantity surveyors can help you avoid those surprises down the line.
Exactly. It brings a level of precision, objectivity that's really invaluable. And the book actually points out some of the advantages they bring. For example, they're independent professionals. They have a reputation for reliable forecasting.
So you can really trust their judgment, knowing that they're not, beholden to any specific vendor or contractor. It's a huge plus. But the book also mentions some potential downsides. What are those?
Well, it's always good to be aware of potential pitfalls, right? So sometimes their historical data, it might not be totally up to date with, those real-time costs. So it's always a good idea to kind of double check with like contractors or suppliers for the latest pricing.
Okay, yeah. It's like checking the price tag at the store before you actually buy something, just to be sure. Makes total sense. Speaking of contractors, the book also talks about really tapping into their expertise during this cost planning phase. Why is that so valuable?
Well, contractors, they're the ones on the ground, right? They're dealing with the day-to-day realities of construction. They have, a really good sense of current labor costs, material costs, and they often have these established relationships with suppliers, which can actually, help lead to savings.
Oh. Well, that's a good point. So leveraging those connections, their practical know-how, it can make a real difference. But the book also cautions against, solely relying on contractors for cost information. Is that
Yeah.
because, their primary goal is to win the bid,
Yeah.
so they might not always give you, the full picture?
That's a valid concern.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's always best to gather information from multiple sources and kind of compare those perspectives before making any big decisions.
Like a balanced diet of information, right? You need those diverse inputs for a healthy outcome.
Okay, so we've got quantity surveyors, contractors. What other resources does the book recommend tapping into?
Well, there's these things called construction cost indices. They're published by government agencies and private companies, and they track, the trends in construction costs over time.
Oh, interesting. So they can help you see that bigger picture of how costs are fluctuating, but they're probably not going to give you those exact numbers for your specific project. Right. Exactly. They're useful for understanding those market trends, but they don't replace the need for those, detailed cost estimates. Now, let's talk about something that everyone loves, contingencies.
Ah, yes. Those lovely financial cushions built into the budget. Because no matter how well you plan, things rarely go perfectly according to plan in the world of construction.
That's the truth. So contingencies, they're essential. They're like insurance policies for those unexpected expenses or changes that, inevitably pop up during a project. They help protect you from those financial blows.
So how do you determine how much contingency to actually include? Is there, a magic formula?
Well, there's no magic formula, but there are guidelines. The book suggests that contingencies can range from as high as 25%, in those early stages when there's a lot of uncertainty, down to around, 2 to 5% as the design gets finalized. It's about kind of gradually reducing that buffer as the project becomes more defined.
Right, that makes sense. It's a balancing act,
Yeah.
right? Being prepared for those unexpected things,
Right.
but not, unnecessarily inflating the budget. This whole conversation, it really highlights just how complex managing construction costs really is. It's way more than just adding up the price of, bricks and mortar.
Oh, absolutely. It's a multifaceted process. And I think, this book, it gives you a really comprehensive framework for navigating all those
Like a
complexities.
roadmap, helping you stay on track and avoid those costly detours. And the journey continues, folks. We'll be right back to dive into the final stretch of this cost exploration adventure. Stick with us. All right, we're back for the final stretch of our construction cost deep dive. We've talked about those different estimation methods, all those sneaky things that can inflate costs, the importance of contingencies, getting expert advice, all that good stuff. Now, our guide, Construction Project Cost Planning and Control, it takes us through each phase of a project, kind of highlighting those specific cost management tasks and considerations.
Yeah, it's like having a checklist for success, making sure those costs are monitored and controlled every step of the way. From the very beginning, like that pre-agreement phase, where you're figuring out the scope, the budget, all the way through to the actual construction and contract administration.
So it's not just like setting a budget at the beginning and just crossing your fingers hoping for the best, right? You got to actively manage those costs throughout the whole project.
Exactly. The book really stresses that, constant communication, collaboration between everyone, the architect, the client, the contractors, consultants. It's a team effort, and everyone needs to be on the same page when it comes to those costs.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so let's walk through some of these phases. Like during that schematic design phase, when those initial design concepts are taking shape, what are some key things to keep in mind?
Well, that's where you really got to establish a preliminary budget, right? Based on the information you have at that point. You want to make sure that design, it aligns with the client's financial goals right from the get-go.
Yeah, it's about finding that balance between the creative vision and the, financial reality. You don't want to design this dream project that's totally out of reach.
Exactly. And then as the design develops, you move into that design development phase, those cost estimates, they need to be refined, updated. This might involve, maybe tweaking the design a bit, adjusting the specs to make sure you stay within budget.
So it's this dynamic process constantly evolving. What about when you get to that construction documentation phase where you're creating those detailed blueprints, specifications, all that?
That's where you're really fine-tuning that budget, making sure every little detail is accounted for. It's like putting together this giant jigsaw puzzle, making sure all the pieces fit, both creatively and financially.
Love that analogy.
Yeah.
Okay, and then you get to the bidding and negotiation phase, right? Where contractors submit their proposals and you're choosing the best fit for the project. That's where things get real.
Oh, yeah, big time. You're comparing bids, you're negotiating contracts, making sure everything lines up with that established budget. The book really emphasizes transparency, being really thorough during this stage, to make sure it's a fair and competitive process.
Right. And then finally, you reach the contract administration phase. The project's actually being built. But that doesn't mean the cost management journey is over, does it?
Nope, not at all. Continued cost monitoring is so important. You're tracking expenses, dealing with any unexpected issues that pop up, which, let's be honest, they always do.
Mhm.
Clear communication, good documentation, that's crucial throughout this whole phase. Helps avoid disputes, make sure everyone's accountable.
Wow, this whole deep dive has been eye-opening. I mean, construction costs, they're so much more complex than I ever realized.
Yeah.
It's amazing how design, finance, project management, it all comes together.
It really does. And this book, Construction Project Cost Planning and Control, it gives you such a valuable roadmap for navigating all that complexity.
It really does. Well, there you have it, folks. Another deep dive complete, another layer of knowledge unlocked. We've explored construction project costs from every angle, from those initial budgets to those long-term expenses, expert advice, all those sneaky things that can drive up costs and how to keep them in check. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What stood out to you most from this deep dive? How will you approach your next project? Or even just how you think about the buildings around you with this newfound knowledge? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're hungry for more deep dives into all sorts of fascinating topics, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing, and we'll see you on our next adventure.